The relationship didn't die when the fighting became routine, or when the betrayals were finally confessed. It died the exact moment you caught a tiny, almost instantaneous twist of their upper lip, a fleeting asymmetry in the face. That wasn't anger or sadness, but something far colder and much more terminal. That flicker, that involuntary retraction of the orbicularis oris, is the microexpression of contempt, and it is the single most accurate predictor that the life you built together is already over. We spend years analyzing grand gestures and dramatic arguments, searching for the fatal blow, but the truth is always found in the smallest, most ignored signals. The death of love is rarely a sudden crash. It is the slow, silent poison delivered through a split-second facial signal that screams, "You are beneath me." This essay is not about relationship repair. It is about forensic psychology and the acceptance of inevitability. Contempt is not merely one of the four horsemen of relational apocalypse. It is the grim reaper itself. Criticism is frustration given voice. Defensiveness is avoidance disguised as argument. Stonewalling is withdrawal. But contempt is the neurological dismissal of another human being. It is superiority complex wrapped in deep-seated disgust. The moment one person truly feels they are looking down on the other, they are no longer in a relationship. They are overseeing an inferior subject. The philosophical weight of contempt is this: it renders the recipient fundamentally unworthy of respect, effort, or even basic human empathy. It converts the partner from an equal participant into an irritating obstacle. If you are tired of shallow, therapeutic, feel-good answers that promise effortless fixes, and if you are ready instead for the cold, clinical truth about human failure and relational decay, take a moment now and subscribe. We deal exclusively in the difficult realities that the mainstream prefers to ignore, because understanding what kills connection is the first step to truly valuing it. The primary devastation of contempt is its asymmetry. The person displaying it usually feels completely justified. They feel intelligent, righteous, and morally superior because they have cataloged their partner's flaws to a point of comprehensive dismissal. The contemptuous gaze finds the partner's deepest insecurities, their lack of ambition, their small failures, their irritating habits, and weaponizes them, not in the heat of a moment, but through calculated, patronizing behavior. Think about the subtle but lethal techniques: the feigned sigh of boredom during a serious conversation, the rolling of the eyes when the partner tells a story, the use of deliberately sophisticated language to make the other feel dumb, or the adoption of a mocking, sweet voice used to deliver cutting sarcasm. These are not mistakes. They are strategic declarations of superiority, and they work because they are designed to bypass anger and go straight for the jugular of self-worth. For the recipient, contempt is not painful because it is mean. It is painful because it implies a final, unchallengeable judgment. When someone is angry, you can fight back. When someone is sad, you can offer comfort. But when someone views you with contempt, you have been designated as a contaminant. Their microexpression confirms what their words dare not fully articulate, that they believe you are an inferior specimen, unworthy of their continued investment. This triggers an existential dread far worse than any shouted accusation. It confirms the suspicion that perhaps deep down, they never truly valued you at all, only the role you played. This is why contempt, once established, is almost impossible to reverse. It requires the contemptuous person to willingly surrender their feeling of superiority and acknowledge the fundamental dignity of the person they have already demoted, a sacrifice few human egos are prepared to make. Contempt is the psychological moment when the self-image held by the recipient is violently shattered and replaced by the judgment of the perpetrator. The pain isn't just about being told you are bad. It's about the terrifying realization that the reality you built with them, the shared history, the private understanding, the affirmation of your worth, was fundamentally false or, worse, conditional. The recipient suffers because the relationship was the primary witness to their value, the safe harbor where their flaws were supposed to be mitigated by love. When contempt enters, that harbor becomes a courtroom, and suddenly every vulnerability they ever disclosed is entered as evidence against them. They are forced into a state of chronic, exhausting self-defense, not just of their actions, but of their very right to exist as a decent person. They begin to internalize the verdict, peering at their own reflection and wondering if the contemptuous gaze was right all along. The ultimate suffering is the collapse of the validated self, the terrifying moment when you realize that the person who swore to cherish you now views you as a permanent, frustrating obstacle to their own happiness. If you want the roadmap out of the dark valleys of the human psyche, and you understand that skipping the analysis means missing the truth entirely, then take 1 second now and hit that subscribe button. We are only just beginning to map the true damage. This unbearable feeling, the sense of being chronically misunderstood and dismissed, is precisely why contempt is utilized so effectively by those who fear inadequacy themselves. Contempt is the lazy man's mastery. It is exponentially easier to catalog a partner's deficits and construct a narrative of moral superiority than it is to look inward and address one's own loneliness, fragility, or lack of agency. By maintaining a posture of disappointment, the contemptuous person gains a fleeting narcotic hit of righteousness. They trade the arduous, vulnerable work of genuine connection for the cheap, immediate power of control. This posture shields them from the most terrifying vulnerability of all, the risk that they might be the one found wanting. The contemptuous gaze doesn't see a flawed human being. It sees a static, irritating object that exists solely to disappoint, thereby justifying the perpetrator's withdrawal, their coldness, and their ultimate abandonment. The internal architecture of dismissal is fascinating and brutal. It operates by freezing the partner in time, turning them into a character defined by their worst moments. Once a person is categorized as the one who is financially irresponsible, or the one who always forgets, or the one who can never finish anything, the perpetrator applies a filter that invalidates any evidence that contradicts this judgment. If the partner succeeds, it is dismissed as luck or an anomaly. If they fail, it confirms the initial, righteous diagnosis. This cognitive rigidity transforms the relationship into a self-fulfilling prophecy of decay. The recipient, starved of positive affirmation and constantly judged, eventually stops trying, which further confirms the contemptuous person's belief that they were right all along. This is not a failure of character. It is the natural psychological response to being trapped in a system designed to deny dignity. The algorithms prefer noise and distraction. They hate analysis this deep. If you are finding value in this unflinching look at reality, please consider subscribing. Your support is the only fuel that keeps these deep dives coming. We must understand that contempt is not just relational. It is the ultimate psychological fuel for our culture wars. Every time a person reduces an entire political or social group to a single, easily mocked caricature, they are engaging in scalable contempt. The structure is identical. Remove the complexity, deny the internal dignity, and establish a narrative of moral superiority that justifies intellectual and emotional withdrawal. The internet has become a vast, anonymous laboratory for practicing contempt, allowing millions to engage in the lethal techniques, the feigned sigh, the eye roll, the sophisticated sarcasm, without the vulnerability of physical presence. When we participate in the architecture of dismissal, whether against a spouse or a stranger online, we are sacrificing our capacity for genuine human engagement for the fleeting, hollow validation of self-righteousness. And the consequence of this universal withdrawal of dignity is the death of all shared reality, leaving us adrift in separate, fortified camps, each convinced of their own immaculate superiority. The death of shared reality is not an accidental byproduct of disagreement. It is the deliberate, predictable outcome of mass-produced contempt. When you deny the inherent dignity of your opponent, whether that opponent is a political ideology, a social class, or a professional body, you execute the final move in the game of withdrawal. You stop arguing about what they did and start diagnosing who they are. The mechanics of this societal collapse are identical to the relational decay we first discussed. Consider the catastrophic political contempt that has paralyzed Western governance. The two primary ideological camps do not simply disagree on the optimal tax rate or the best approach to foreign policy. They define the opposition through a filter of irredeemable moral failure. One side views the other not merely as fiscally cautious but as inherently greedy, cold, and fundamentally interested in human suffering. The counter-narrative views the first side not as socially progressive, but as naive, ideologically driven children who are actively working to destroy the necessary structures of society. Look closely at the architecture of the exchange. Policy arguments disappear entirely. Instead, every action taken by the other side is immediately filtered through the established contemptuous stereotype. The activists' desire for change is proof of their naive anti-capitalism. The conservatives' desire for border control is proof of their deep-seated xenophobia. This is the psychological genius of contempt. It provides a shortcut past rational engagement directly to self-righteous condemnation. It saves the enormous mental energy required to understand why a reasonable person might hold an opposing view. Why bother with nuance when you can simply conclude that your opponent is driven by malice, stupidity, or corruption? Why seek common ground when the existence of the other party is defined by its moral deficiency? This belief system becomes an impenetrable, self-sealing reality where the only logical response is not dialogue, but containment, marginalization, or, in its most aggressive form, eradication. This withdrawal from shared dignity is why our cultural discourse now orbits around the performance of moral purity rather than the pursuit of practical truth. We are not interested in the messy, compromising work of governance. We are addicted to the cheap psychological rush of confirming our own superiority. Contempt is morally intoxicating, a sugar high for the ego that provides immediate validation without requiring any actual work or sacrifice. If you find yourself nodding along to this diagnosis, resisting the algorithms that prefer division and shallow noise, I urge you to subscribe. This platform is dedicated to diving beneath the surface-level toxicity and exploring the difficult truths that most refuse to touch. Supporting this work ensures that these deep dissections of the human condition can continue. The result is a civilization that has developed an extraordinary capacity to generate information, but has lost the ability to convert that information into shared wisdom, because wisdom requires mutual recognition of legitimacy. When we look out at the world today, we see two parallel universes running simultaneously, each meticulously curated to confirm the moral depravity of the residents of the other. The person next door, the colleague across the table, the family member who voted differently. They cease to be complex individuals with legitimate fears and motivations. They become merely props in our internal morality play, living proof that our side is the custodian of light and their side is the agent of chaos. This is why facts have stopped working. Facts cannot penetrate a defense mechanism built on moralizing contempt. You can present data, statistics, and verifiable evidence, but the contemptuous person will simply apply the filter. That data must be flawed, because anyone pushing that conclusion is clearly motivated by a malignant agenda. The evidence is dismissed, not based on its methodology, but based on the perceived character flaw of the source. The most tragic consequence of this universal weaponization of contempt is the psychological sterilization of the individual. When you spend all your intellectual capital on defining who is despicable and why, you necessarily starve the parts of your mind responsible for curiosity, empathy, and creative problem-solving. Contempt makes us brilliant critics and terrible builders. It sharpens the blade of dismissal, but dulls the capacity for construction. To build something, a meaningful relationship, a functional policy, a successful business, requires the humility to acknowledge error, the tolerance for ambiguity, and the willingness to accept imperfect collaborators. Contempt thrives only in a sterilized environment of imagined perfection, where the only thing that matters is the moral cleanliness of the observer. Therefore, the final verdict must be harsh. Contempt is not a sign of moral rigor or superior intelligence. It is a sign of profound psychological laziness. It is the cheapest currency in the mental marketplace, offering maximum perceived benefit, the feeling of being right, for minimum intellectual effort. We must abandon the seductive ease of contempt for the terrifying, difficult work of radical empathy. That is the only path back from the separate fortresses we have constructed. It is the only way to reestablish a shared commitment to reality. If you recognize the urgency of this challenge and want to be part of the community that chooses difficult truth over easy validation, hit the subscribe button now and join us. The deepest, most insidious lie fueling this culture of contempt is the notion that public moral outrage constitutes real civic engagement or, even worse, justice. We have convinced ourselves that the instantaneous, performative dismissal of a person or an idea, usually administered from the safety of a screen, is a meaningful act of moral rigor. It is not. It is the perfect marriage of psychological laziness and technological amplification. Actual justice, true accountability, demands grueling, protracted labor, reforming institutions, drafting policy, engaging with hostile stakeholders, bearing the personal cost of confrontation, and waiting years for incremental results. Contempt, by contrast, offers the immediate, intoxicating rush of self-righteousness, the instant elevation to the moral high ground, requiring only 3 seconds of typing and 0 personal risk. When you click Share on a takedown piece, or post a scathing critique designed not to educate but to humiliate, you are not fighting for justice. You are purchasing a dopamine hit and a membership card to a perceived moral elite. The lie is that we are holding others accountable, when in reality, we are simply performing our own moral superiority for an audience that is primed to reward aggression and dismissal. This distinction between accountability and performance is critical, and failing to grasp it is why our society feels stuck in perpetual outrage without progress. Accountability seeks to reform a system or correct a behavior. It requires nuance, the acknowledgement of complex motives, and the possibility of forgiveness or rehabilitation. Contempt demands annihilation. It insists that the offender be morally exiled, not because it solves the problem, but because their exile solidifies the virtue of the observer and their tribe. The moment a complex issue becomes an easy opportunity for moralizing, the actual complexity is jettisoned. We stop asking, how do we fix this? And start asking, who can we blame and how completely can we ruin them? The problem itself is no longer the focus. It has been weaponized into a resource, an endless source of fuel for the engine of tribal belonging. The longer the problem persists, the more opportunities there are to demonstrate superior virtue by condemning the failures of others. This analysis, this willingness to separate moral performance from moral action, requires a level of intellectual honesty that is increasingly rare in public discourse. If you find value in dissecting these deep societal mechanics, rather than just skimming the surface of conventional wisdom, take a moment now to subscribe. It is how we ensure this kind of essential critical thinking can continue. The psychological reward system is terrifyingly efficient. By using contempt, the lazy mind achieves 2 critical simultaneous victories. First, it creates an immediate exemption from its own moral scrutiny. If I am busy and vigorously pointing out the evil in them, I must, by definition, be good. My moral energy is outsourced, spent entirely on others. Second, it guarantees inclusion. Contempt is a powerful social glue. Nothing bonds a group faster or stronger than a shared enemy perceived as morally contaminated. When you participate in the digital piling on, you are confirming your allegiance to the tribe, signaling your trustworthiness, and securing your place as a moral insider. The cost of this inclusion is intellectual paralysis. Once you commit to the emotional ease of contempt, genuine intellectual curiosity becomes a threat, because curiosity naturally leads to understanding, and understanding is the antithesis of contempt. The moment you understand the logic, the fears, or the context that drives the despised behavior, your righteous moral framework begins to crumble. To maintain the purity of the contempt, you must remain willfully ignorant of the enemy's humanity. The reason the mind gravitates toward this toxic simplification is that the alternative, honest self-assessment combined with the acceptance of complexity, is cognitively and existentially exhausting. The modern world presents us with an unbearable reality that the problems are too big, the trade-offs are too painful, and often the failures of the system are simply the result of competing, reasonable interests crashing into each other, not the result of cartoonish evil. This ambiguity, This crushing reality that nobody is fully right and nobody is entirely innocent is a spiritual burden too heavy for the mass mind to carry. Contempt, therefore, is the great, seductive anesthetic. It allows the individual to shrink the infinite complexity of the world down to a single, morally legible narrative. Them, the bad ones, are the reason for all suffering. This moral architecture is built on convenience, not truth. We are not just avoiding the difficulty of fixing the world. We are primarily avoiding the agonizing difficulty of fixing ourselves. The deepest psychological suffering of the moral zealot is the utter failure of self-correction. By maintaining a posture of moral outrage directed outward, the inner landscape becomes a perpetually unexamined ruin. The flaws, the hypocrisies, the unacknowledged laziness or malice that resides in every human being must still find an outlet. They do not vanish. They are merely projected onto the designated villain. The enemy becomes a necessary psychological container, a shadow repository. The more intensely you despise the political opponent, the cultural transgressor, or the social deviant, the more effectively you have outsourced your own guilt and shame. This is the source of the terrible, hollow hunger that drives the digital crusader. It is the frantic, unconscious need to destroy the external manifestation of the self-loathing they refuse to acknowledge within. They are not fighting for justice. They are fighting for the temporary cessation of their own unbearable self-awareness. If you are resonating with this dissection of our hidden psychological contracts, if you understand that the comfortable narrative is often the most destructive one, I would ask you to consider subscribing now. This channel is dedicated to exploring these uncomfortable, essential truths, and your support is what allows us to continue building this deep, analytical work against the rising tide of intellectual noise. The suffering escalates when this external moralizing begins to actively block genuine personal development. Growth requires humility. It requires admitting that what you believed yesterday might be wrong, or at least incomplete. But once contempt has established its reign, certainty becomes the highest virtue. Doubt is reframed as moral weakness, and introspection is dismissed as an unnecessary distraction from the real fight. The individual trades their potential for personal evolution for the cheap, fleeting dopamine hit of communal righteousness. They become morally rich in performance and spiritually bankrupt in reality. The profound tragedy is that the pain they seek to alleviate, the existential insecurity of being imperfect and finite, is actually deepened by their defensive strategy. They achieve immediate psychological safety at the terrible cost of becoming rigid, brittle, and incapable of absorbing any new data that contradicts their perfect, purified worldview. They have traded the dangerous freedom of self-creation for the suffocating comfort of being a predictable, righteous cog in a moral machine. This is the ultimate verdict. The moralizing mind, trapped in the loop of contempt, is engaged in a profound act of self-betrayal. It is the sophisticated refusal to live a complex life, preferring instead the shallow validation of being perpetually against something. This isn't just a political problem. It is an epidemic of spiritual cowardice, where we prefer the certainty of condemnation over the terrifying, difficult work of construction. We become addicted to the drama of moral performance until the performance itself is the only thing left. The person who screams the loudest about their opponent's inhumanity is usually the one most desperate to deny their own. We must recognize this mechanism not as a feature of high moral character, but as a deep, painful psychological disorder of avoidance. If you choose the path of uncomfortable honesty over the ease of outrage, join this community by subscribing. Let's face the true nature of the self and the world together. The mechanism is terrifyingly efficient because it feeds itself. Every act of condemnation reinforces the righteousness of the condemner, creating a positive feedback loop of moral narcissism. This is why the digital landscape is not merely populated by arguments, but structurally dominated by rituals of spiritual cleansing. We do not engage in debate to find synthesis. We engage in spectacle to find targets. Consider the economy of outrage, the most profound modern example of this moralizing corruption. The platform rewards certainty, brevity, and cruelty. If you approach a complex issue, say systemic poverty or judicial reform, with nuance acknowledgement of trade-offs, and a recognition of historical depth, your analysis falls into the algorithmic void. It is too slow, too difficult, too honest. But if you take that same problem and reduce it to the singular moral failure of an easily identifiable villain, packaging that contempt into a concise, easily shareable denunciation, the engine roars to life. The algorithm doesn't reward wisdom, it rewards rage. The brutal reality is that millions now participate daily in a collective digital witch hunt, not because they are inherently monstrous, but because the structure of the digital commons makes contempt the path of least resistance to validation. The moralizing mind has found its perfect theater. It allows an individual to feel the thrill of revolutionary fervor, the righteous glow of being on the right side of history, without ever having to leave their couch, volunteer their time, or sacrifice a penny. The sacrifice demanded is merely cognitive, the abandonment of complexity, the willful simplification of human experience, and the utter surrender of mercy. The ultimate irony is that the person performing this furious, highly visible moral cleanup is often neglecting the true moral responsibilities right in front of them, the messy, unglamorous duties of actual kindness, local contribution, or quiet, self-sacrificing dedication to people who genuinely need help. They prioritize the abstract, public performance of hating a distant evil over the concrete, private difficulty of loving a close imperfection. And this is precisely how the cycle hollows out the soul. Contempt is psychologically addictive because it offers immediate status and group affiliation, but it is spiritually corrosive because it is a relationship built entirely on negation. You define yourself solely by what you are against, ensuring that the source of your identity must always remain vibrant and hated. The system requires an endless stream of heretics to maintain its purification rituals. What happens when you run out of external enemies? The moral machine, hungry for its fuel, turns inward. Suddenly, microscopic deviations from the communal orthodoxy become high crimes. Yesterday's ally is today's sacrificial lamb, not because their ideas drastically changed, but because the system demands more blood to prove the remaining member's purity. This pathology metastasizes, destroying the capacity for error, forgiveness, or grace within the group. If you find value in cutting through this noise and supporting analysis that refuses to be sold for cheap outrage, please subscribe and help sustain this independent thinking. The terrifying truth is that the moralizer, trapped in this loop, is not seeking justice. They are seeking an escape from accountability. Accountability requires self-reflection, and self-reflection reveals flaws, inconsistencies, and inconvenient compromises, the very things the contemptuous worldview is built to deny. By focusing their entire moral energy on the external failures of others, they manage to construct a temporary, fragile fortress around their own unexamined life. They outsource their entire sense of worth to the performance of public disgust. But this fortress is built on sand, because they have never truly wrestled with their own shadow, never faced the uncomfortable truths of their capacity for cruelty, selfishness, and error. They become utterly brittle. They are terrified of being caught in a moment of hypocrisy, because hypocrisy isn't just a mistake for them. It's an existential threat that dismantles the entire carefully constructed moral identity. This explains the disproportionate, almost maniacal reaction when a moralizing individual or group is exposed. The fury is not directed outwards at the accuser. It is the sheer panic of the self-betrayer whose elaborate defense mechanism has just been breached. They must destroy the messenger because the message carries the terrible, undeniable truth that the pursuit of external purity is merely the greatest obstacle to achieving internal wholeness. The moralizing mind is ultimately a fugitive mind, constantly running from the difficult, quiet work of self-acceptance, forever demanding that the world conform to their perfect script so they never have to confront the complexity of their own terrible, wonderful human failure. This, then, is the tragic verdict. The moralizing project fails because it fundamentally misunderstands the source of human goodness. It operates on the false premise that morality is a state of achievement, a pristine castle to be defended, when in reality it is a constant, messy, grinding process of maintenance. The obsession with external purity is not virtue. It is a profound weakness that guarantees the destruction of community and self. By demanding perfection from the world, they guarantee their own isolation and spiritual famine. True moral authority is never found in the person who flawlessly performs the expected gestures. It is only ever found in the person who has faced their own capacity for malice, sat with that knowledge, and decided, deliberately, to choose the better path anyway. The greatest ethical challenge is not how loudly we can denounce the crimes of strangers, but how honestly we can admit the small, persistent cruelty we find within our own hearts. The real work of living, the only path to genuine peace, is the terrifying realization that you are both the hero and the villain in your own story, and that grace is the capacity to live with that paradox. Do not confuse the frantic search for flawless external behavior with the silent, difficult bravery of self-acceptance. The megaphone offers simplicity, but the mirror demands complexity, and complexity is always where the truth hides. Choose the shadow work. Choose the quiet, agonizing honesty over the easy, addictive certainty of contempt. If you are willing to walk away from the comforting noise and join a community committed to this kind of profound, unsettling exploration, then make sure you subscribe right now. Don't just watch, join the conversation. Let's keep thinking. So choose the painful truth over the pleasing lie, because morality is not a destination, but a relentless return to the mirror. The world needs fewer judges and more honest failures. Find the strength to live in the complexity. This is the hard road, and if you're ready to walk it with us, subscribe now.